At the end of the 2000s, Crytek had the reputation of creating one of the most graphically demanding games. And not only that, with incredible physics. With Crysis in 2007, they had delivered something that was revolutionary. Maybe not in its story, but what they achieved technically separated it from any other FPS. The studio had created Crysis as a tech demo and ended up turning it into a full game. It was basically a pro showcase for other developers to see their engine and what they were capable of so they could use it in their games. With this on their record, Crytek saw the next generation of consoles, which came in the form of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, as the opportunity to prove that what they had achieved was no accident, that they had everything to repeat it and create the most revolutionary game to date, both graphically and in terms of gameplay. And that's where a game, well, actually 2 games about the Roman Empire started to take shape. This ended up in a title that did not live up to what was expected neither by Xbox, Crytek, nor the fans. The story of this game is complicated, it is somewhat disappointing, but mostly interesting. Today we will try to answer what the hell happened to Ryse, son of Rome. Before launching Crysis, Crytek, a studio based in Germany, had already released a game that had proven its ability to create excellent games. Far Cry, released in 2004 in conjunction with Ubisoft, was an amazing title for its time. However, Ubisoft wanted to create continuous installments of it, and Crytek did not want to stagnate in a single franchise. So it left Far Cry in the hands of the French company and began to create its own shooter. But in 2006, when Crysis was about to close its development, they began to contemplate the idea of creating other games. They had 2 main ideas. The first was a massive role-playing game called Kings. The second, a first-person RPG title called Kingdoms. Savat Yerli, Crytek's CEO, started working with his team to create concepts for both. His main intention was to expand the development capabilities of his studio and work on several projects simultaneously. Some of Crytek's members created concepts for these games, concept art, a small game universe, among other things that they would use to try to convince a publisher to support their projects. After launching Crysis in 2007, the studio had more eyes on them. This led them to have a meeting with Microsoft in 2009, who out of the 2 projects was only interested in their first-person RPG, Kingdoms. Microsoft witnessed a demo where a player stood in a burning courtyard and fought various enemies in a visceral and bloody manner, all set in a medieval fantasy universe. In an interview for Polygon, Crytek's general manager, Nick Button-Brown, mentioned that this was not a working game, it was just a proof of concept with which they were trying to prove that first-person melee combat could be balanced and be fun for a full game. In this demo, they had an estimated release window 2011. The concept and what was seen at this meeting eventually reached Phil Spencer's ears, who at the time was the vice president of Microsoft Studios. Spencer was attracted to the project and he began communications with Crytek. By that time, Xbox had revealed one of their biggest secrets, something they had been working on for the past few years. Project Natal, a device that was intended to be able to capture the movement of players accurately, with the goal of creating experiences that would be enjoyed beyond a controller, taking the player to a more interactive plane with games. The idea of working on a game for what would end up being the KINECT was something very much pushed by the now head of Microsoft's gaming division, Spencer. Crytek, on their part, was eager to work with Xbox, and the idea of using hardware that would allow them to achieve their goal, to once again create a revolutionary game that was graphically the most impressive the industry had seen so far. The work that Crytek had done on this game during 2006 up to the moment they closed a deal with Xbox had to be changed. Crytek assigned its Budapest subsidiary to the gargantuan project. The controller would no longer be used. Instead, the player would have to use his hands to simulate having a shield and a sword in the other. The intention, to make a game that would make the player feel like a mighty warrior in a bloody and brutal battlefield. Now they just needed the KINECT to deliver on its promises to make this game incredible. At E3 2010, the game that until then had been codenamed Kingdoms was revealed to the world, not with gameplay, not with any idea of what it was about, just a live action trailer mentioning that Crytek would make it and that it would be published by Microsoft Game Studios. By early 2011, Crytek's main studio in Frankfurt had taken control of Kingdoms. While there were no reports of development issues, there were a few things that hinted that this was the case, as shortly after, Crytek fired members of the Budapest team and transformed this subsidiary into a mobile games studio. By the summer of that same year, the project finally had a name, Ryse. There is much speculation as to why Ryse Son of Rome has a Greek Y in its name, as the word has a Latin I in it. Some believe that it is because being a game based on the Roman Empire, it could not have a letter that did not exist in the Roman alphabet. But this is probably because words like Ryse cannot be trademarked as intellectual property, while an invented word like Ryse can. This also defined that the game would not be a medieval fantasy, but would be set in the era of the Roman Empire. Thus it was given the subtitle Son of Rome. Another important event happened during this year. After taking the lead of the development, the Frankfurt team started to question if it was really the best option to base the development of this game around the Kinect. But E3 was upon them, Xbox needed to show games, and so Ryse was presented to the world. In this trailer, you could see a player using one hand to cover himself and another to attack. In fact, he could even throw his sword, headbutt, kick enemies, among other things. This moment is described by Sevet Ural as a market test. How could a first-person hack and slash, which was handled by motion controls, work? That was a question that behind Crytek's doors was proving difficult to answer. They were trying to shape it, testing different concepts and modes for the game. Among them, a multiplayer they worked on together with Ruffian Games, best known for creating Crackdown, which was eventually removed from the game. 2011 would be a chaotic year for Crytek. They were still testing how to make the Kinect work. They created mechanics to disguise the input lag of the device. A big problem was how to solve the navigation. After all, in a game with a controller, the player moves a joystick. With the Kinect, they were contemplating the idea of having the player do the running motion in order to move forward, something like Kinect Sports did. But the studio was concerned about how this would affect the player's experience, as it would make playing Ryse a very physically demanding experience. To try to solve this, they thought of making Ryse something like an interactive movie, a game on rails, described this way by Rasmus Højgaard, Crytek's creative director during development. The studio took a certain liking to this idea. It's a narrative-heavy on-rails game with dialogue and branching based on the player's decisions, and 4 hours long to make it perfect for the Kinect. In addition, this will also allow them to focus on exploiting the Xbox 360 to the fullest and show what the CryEngine, their proprietary engine, was capable of graphically. To come to the conclusion of which path they should take, they set up 3 demos. One that allowed to play the title only with the Kinect. One that was a combination of the Xbox 360 controller and some Kinect features, and one that just used the controller, but this last one was not in first person. It would show the protagonist, Marius. But their internal testing was basically useless because after the studio staff tested the 3 prototypes, they couldn't conclude which one was better. So they began external testing, which showed that just using the control would be the general preference. Also, these tests showed that players preferred to see their character and not a first-person game. Crytek began to realize that making a Kinect-free, third-person, cinematic experience could result in a more engaging and higher quality game. In addition, there was an important point to consider according to design director Patrick Esteves. If they used Kinect, they were going to spend a lot of time teaching players how to do even basic actions in the game instead of having them immersed in their world, and that was the turning point. But Xbox had already pitched this game as something that would take advantage of Kinect. Even though the motion sensing hardware by 2011 had already demonstrated its weaknesses. Shortly thereafter, Spencer and the Crytek team had a meeting in which they had to define whether they would continue to make a Kinect-based game. Both parties agreed to drop the augmented reality technology, fearing that the most hardcore players were not convinced by Microsoft's new hardware. This would lead to a significant change again from everything Crytek had done for the game. Kingdoms had gone from being a first-person game to a Kinect-based one, then to one that went back to just using the controller, but now in third person. But with Crytek's vision to create the most graphically impressive game to date, another change was in store, and that was to leave the Xbox 360 behind to focus on the next console generation. The shift came from 2 main factors: harnessing the power of the next generation to deliver something visually better than what they could achieve with the Xbox 360. Second, Crytek had to work a lot of things to accommodate the new vision, and this was going to take time. So instead of releasing a game for a console that was on its way out, it was better to move to the Xbox One, which, by the way, at the time had no name, and Xbox hadn't told developers nothing about, but everyone knew it was coming. Even without knowing the specs of it, Crytek was making their engine capable of delivering a visually stunning game. It wasn't like they were struggling, they had already done it with Crysis. And from a business perspective, this move benefited Crytek, as other developers could see what their engine was capable of and decide to use it for their games on the next generation of consoles. And for Xbox, it was a chance to show what their console would be able to achieve. The shift to third person came with its challenges. They had to put much more emphasis on the animations, not only of their character, but on the enemies, their faces, armor, physics, and so on. The team believed that third-person combat did not feel as intense as first-person, and looking for balance, they created different conditions. One where an enemy should take few hits to die, helping the rhythm of the combat, and another where no off-screen enemy should be able to hit the player. And then there was the new cinematic approach to the game. Crytek worked hard on getting accurate movements, having good performances and material to interpret it digitally. To achieve this, they worked with the Imaginarium Studios, capture studio owned by actor Andy Serkis, a legend in the acting industry. Although they were focused on an experience that was lived through the control, they still had something to solve: how they would use the KINECT. After all, Phil Spencer kept mentioning that the game will use this hardware, although it was understood that it would no longer be the main selling point of it. Crytek decided that they would only use it in one area: voice commands. The player would be able to give orders to his troops, encourage them, trigger executions, among other things, but it would be reduced to this. At E3 2013, Son of Rome was announced as an Xbox One exclusive title. Gameplay was shown of what promised to be an odyssey, with a Roman warrior seeking revenge for the death of his family. It would be a launch title for the console, which meant that it would be released on November 22nd of that year. It is worth noting that within Crytek, some thought they still needed more time to polish the game. Sivat Yerli, in an interview with Eurogamer, commented that they asked the team if they wanted more months of development or to fulfill to launch it alongside the Xbox One. The response from the development team was unanimous. They wanted to be part of the Xbox One launch, stating that it was something emotional that they wanted to be involved in. After more than 6 years of being conceptualized, Codename Kingdoms arrived in the form of Ryse Son of Rome, after a somewhat troubled development that underwent several changes over the years, and the final product proved it. Players were faced with a visually stunning game, even to this day, but locked in corridors with combat that felt very basic, with redundant executions, very limited options, and most annoying of all, repetitive. From one hallway they went to another. It seemed that the idea of the game being on rails and the development they did for the KINECT and solving mobility with this device had remained in the title, perhaps due to lack of time or not being able to invest more in this part of the game. The commands were confusing. Instead of showing the XYAB buttons, it showed its colors in multiple QuickTime events, of which the game was plagued. This was perhaps Crytek's idea of a cinematic game. Its length was also short, barely passing 6 hours. During development, Sivat Yerli said that they wanted to make a game that was on rails, highly scripted, lasting 4 hours, and with combat and dialogue options. But while this was considering the KINECT, it was something that didn't work for a game that featured a completely different interface. It felt oddly outdated mechanically, even if it was visually stunning. This earned it a poor reception. It wasn't what gamers expected from a launch game for Xbox's new console. Technically, it had some good things going for it. The game ran well and had a seamlessness that had not been achieved so far. It went from cinematics to gameplay in a way that we are used to today. You could switch between your executions and skills quickly, even in combat, which was a bit strange and could make the player invincible. The implementation of QuickTime events, although in excess, was done in a very smooth way. But it was the level design, its missions, and the little variety of scenarios, paths, and combat, which ended up hurting the game. Still, Microsoft was keen to create a sequel, but apparently this would come with its compromises. Xbox would fund such a sequel, but the rights to Ryse should be held by the publisher, which reportedly led Crytek to cancel the sequel, as they were not willing to give up their IP. Sometime later, the game came out for PC after being said to be an Xbox-only exclusive. And in an interview with Eurogamer, Sivat Yerli mentioned that they were not happy with Xbox One sales, and that if they created Ryse 2, it would be when there were more 8th generation consoles on the market. In that same interview, he was asked if Ryse 2 would be released for PlayStation 4 or if Microsoft had any privilege over the game. Yerli's answer was, "We do whatever we want with whoever we want. It's our IP." However, during those years, 2014 and 2015, Crytek was involved in several controversies involving not paying its employees. Financially, the company's situation was not good. In 2014, Yerli denied that the studio was in trouble or that they would not pay their employees, although sometime later it was confirmed that both situations were true. And by 2015, a deal with Amazon to license the use of CryEngine 3 was credited with saving the studio from bankruptcy. Ryse, Son of Rome, besides having a development full of changes of direction, was also destined to be the last AAA game of the company. Since 2012, Crytek's CEO had stated that from that point onwards, they would only make free-to-play games, something that did not turn out to be the case. Some years later, they launched Hunt Showdown, title in which they have been focused since 2018 with good financial results, and with projects like The Climb being released for virtual reality. In recent months, rumors have surfaced about the development of Ryse 2. Many believe that Crytek is developing a new game in the franchise, although some of those rumors come from a Twitter post where they ask about the memories fans have with Marius Titus. This honestly could have just been a post only because Crytek fondly remembers the franchise, and this year marks the 10th anniversary of its launch. Actually, this rumor has been around for many years now, with nothing being confirmed by the studio, and in reality, it could be a gamble in which they are not willing to bet on, considering that they have found a successful business model with Hunt. Rumors say the game would be multi-platform and tie it to the hiring Crytek was doing recently. But as always, if Ryse returns, only time will tell. Ryse, Son of Rome had the potential to be one of the best games at Xbox One's launch, even for the console in general, but its development suffered several stumbles, several changes due to the interest of a publisher looking to make their augmented reality hardware get a game that would reveal its value and possibilities, and finally, it ended up being more of a playable tech demo than a video game with depth, variety, and impact. Even so, there are many players who have recently been able to experience it thanks to its arrival on Game Pass, who consider that a second chance for this franchise would be something incredible. Tell me in the comments, how do you remember Ryse, Son of Rome if you played it when it came out, or if you played it sometime later? If you like this content, consider subscribing and following me in my social media, links in the description. See you next time.